Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. April 26th is one of those dates where history does not politely enter the room so much as kick the door open, track mud across the carpet, and announce that civilization is about to learn something the hard way. Today gives us philosophers who wanted peace but got war, poets who climbed mountains and immediately felt guilty about enjoying the view, bankers who turned Easter Mass into a mob movie, colonists who landed in paradise and were attacked before bedtime, teenage girls outriding famous men, scientists being forced to admit peasants saw space rocks correctly, and governments discovering that trust us is not a disaster response plan. It is a day about ambition, violence, wonder, collapse, and the eternal human habit of creating a crisis, then acting surprised when the crisis behaved like one. Segment 1. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121, and history immediately began circling him like a recruiter at a college philosophy department who also owns a sword. He was serious, gifted, and so visibly responsible that Emperor Hadrian looked at him and said, essentially, "That child has the haunted eyes of a man who should inherit every problem in the Mediterranean." Marcus did not chase power. Power chased him, tackled him, adopted him into the imperial succession, and handed him a border crisis with a bow on it. That is the central joke of his life. The man most famous for writing about inner peace spent most of his reign dealing with Parthians, Germanic tribes, plague, logistics, and the ancient Roman version of checking your email at 2 a.m. The meditation sounds like it should have been written beside a fountain by a calm man in sandals, but much of it came from freezing military camps, where the candles were weak, the mud was strong, and the soldiers were probably asking if the emperor's journal had a section on not dying today. Marcus became the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, which is both a compliment and a warning label, because after him came Commodus, proof that even Stoics can make one catastrophic parenting decision. The empire had spent generations choosing competence over bloodline, and Marcus, the philosopher king, looked at his son and said, "How bad could nepotism be?" Rome answered that question with several centuries of screaming. Segment 2. The more than 1,000 years later, on April 26, 1336, Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux for the radical reason that he wanted to see what was up there, which in the Middle Ages was basically suspicious behavior. Mountains were for armies, pilgrims, traders, and people being punished by geography, not poets looking for a nice view and a personal breakthrough. Petrarch's climb matters because it captures the early Renaissance mind turning toward the world and saying, maybe Earth is not just a grim waiting room with bad roads. He goes up the mountain with his brother, pushes past an old shepherd who basically serves as the medieval Yelp review for "do not recommend," and reaches the summit, where he sees rivers, mountains, distance, beauty, possibility, and the entire planet suddenly looking less like a punishment and more like a subject. Then, because history loves emotional whiplash, he opens St. Augustine and lands on a passage scolding people for admiring mountains while ignoring their souls. That is such perfect timing, it feels like God personally subtweeted him. 1 minute Petrarch is inventing scenic tourism, the next he is having a spiritual customer service complaint at 6,000 feet. But that contradiction is exactly why the moment feels modern. He wants beauty and meaning, self-discovery and moral discipline, the view and the guilt about enjoying the view. In other words, Petrarch climbs a mountain and accidentally invents the Renaissance and the vacation anxiety journal. Segment 3, and sacred spaces, sharp knives, and bad political timing. By April 26, 1478, Florence had reached the point in Renaissance politics where banking, art, religion, and murder were all apparently in the same group chat. The Pazzi conspiracy unfolded inside the Duomo during Easter Mass, which is already a bold choice if your plan is restore civic virtue through stabbing. The Pazzi family, backed by rivals and tangled with papal ambition, tried to eliminate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano at the most sacred moment of worship, when everyone's head was bowed and nobody expected the homily to include knives. Giuliano was brutally killed, but Lorenzo fought back, wrapped his cloak around his arm like a Renaissance action hero who forgot his shield, and escaped with only a wound to the neck. The conspirators expected Florence to rise up chanting for liberty. Instead, the city looked at them and decided it preferred the Medici brand of oligarchy to whatever this was. Jacopo de Pazzi rode through the streets yelling, "People and freedom!" and got the political response every failed coup fears most: awkward silence followed by a mob. The plot meant to weaken Lorenzo made him more powerful, because nothing consolidates authority quite like surviving an assassination attempt during church. Florence then responded with public executions, erased family names, and a level of vengeance that makes modern cancel culture look like a politely worded email. The lesson is simple. If your revolution depends on murdering popular bankers in a cathedral, maybe have a backup plan besides yelling slogans at confused pedestrians. Segment 4, and New World's Old Violence and the Teenager Who Finished the Ride. April 26th also brings two American origin stories that are very different but connected by the same uneasy truth. History often begins with someone arriving in the dark and nobody fully understanding what comes next. In 1607, English colonists landed at Cape Henry after months at sea, stepped onto the Virginia coast, and immediately began the long, complicated, violent process that would lead to Jamestown, British America, and eventually the United States. They saw goodly tall trees and promising land, which is colonial language for we have already started mentally naming things after people who are not here. But the first day also brought conflict with native warriors, reminding us that the continent was not empty, not waiting, and not asking for a shareholder-funded surprise visit from the Virginia Company. Then, in 1777, Sybil Ludington gave the Revolution one of its most underappreciated rides, traveling around 40 miles in rain and darkness to rally militia after the British attack on Danbury. Paul Revere got the poem, the fame, and the merch table. Sybil got a storm, a horse, a stick, a musket, and a much longer route. She was 16, which means she did all this at an age when today we worry someone might not be ready to manage a group project. Her story exposes one of history's favorite bad habits, turning men into legends quickly while making women wait a century for a statue and a stamp. Apparently, bravery counts faster when it rhymes. Segment 5, and the sky throws rocks and science has to apologize. On April 26, 1803, the town of L'Aigle in Normandy experienced something that sounds like a biblical punishment written by a geologist. Thousands of stones fell from the sky. For centuries, educated Europeans had dismissed reports of falling rocks as peasant nonsense, because nothing says Enlightenment confidence like telling people the thing that landed in their field did not happen. The problem was that too many witnesses saw too many stones across too wide an area for the old explanations to hold. So the French Academy set Jean-Baptiste Biot to investigate, and Biot did something revolutionary. He listened to the evidence instead of protecting the theory. He checked the local geology, examined the fragments, interviewed witnesses from different social classes, and realized the villagers were not all engaged in an elaborate regional performance art project called Line About Space Gravel. His work proved that meteorites came from beyond Earth, forcing science to widen its imagination. That is the beauty of the L'Aigle event. It shows empirical truth barging into the salon with muddy boots. The experts had the prestige, the language, and the inherited philosophy. The farmers had the rocks, and in the end, the rocks won. Science advances when it admits that reality does not need permission from a committee before falling out of the sky. Segment 6, and modernity learns to measure, bomb, explode, vote, and withdraw. The modern April 26th is almost absurdly crowded, like history saved all its loud machinery for one calendar square. In 1865, John Wilkes Booth died in a burning Virginia barn after assassinating Abraham Lincoln, denying the country a full public trial and opening the trapdoor beneath a century of conspiracy theories. His final words, "useless, useless," were aimed at his own hands, which is a grimly theatrical ending for an actor who mistook murder for destiny. In 1935, Charles Richter's earthquake scale gave humanity a clearer way to measure catastrophe, and the disturbing math behind it reminds us that nature does not do linear increments. A bigger quake is not just louder, it is the planet switching from angry email to demolition notice. 2 years later, Guernica was bombed by German and Italian aircraft during the Spanish Civil War, turning a Basque town into a preview of modern terror bombing and inspiring Picasso's great anti-war Scream on canvas. Then, April 26th gives us Chernobyl in 1986, the nightmare safety test that became history's most infamous argument against disabling safety systems. It is hard to invent a darker phrase than, "We caused the disaster while testing how to prevent a disaster." But Soviet bureaucracy managed it with concrete, graphite, and denial. Yet this date also offers democratic repair. Tanzania's union in 1964 showed post-colonial nation building could aim for unity across ethnic and linguistic complexity. South Africa's 1994 multiracial election turned lines of voters into a rebuke of apartheid. And Lebanon's 2005 Syrian withdrawal proved mass civilian pressure could push out an occupation. April 26th does not give us a clean moral arc. It gives us wreckage and courage, arrogance and accountability, proof that humans can measure destruction, cause destruction, survive destruction, and occasionally vote their way out of it. In conclusion, April 26th is history's reminder that civilization is not a steady march forward. It is more like a group project where one person is writing philosophy in a war tent. One person is climbing a mountain and feeling bad about it. One person is trying to assassinate a banker during Mass. One person is insisting the sky rocks are fake, and one person has disabled the safety system to test safety. But buried inside all that chaos is the stubborn human capacity to learn, organize, resist, rebuild, and sometimes admit the peasants were right about the meteorites. Marcus Aurelius teaches us that power does not guarantee wisdom, but wisdom can make power less monstrous. Petrarch teaches us that curiosity can change the way a civilization sees itself. Sybil Luddington teaches us that courage does not always get the poem it deserves. Guernica and Chernobyl teach us what happens when systems value control over truth. South Africa, Tanzania, and Lebanon remind us that history is not only made by emperors, generals, and disasters. It is also made by people standing in lines, filling streets, speaking a common language, and refusing to let fear have the final vote.